Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very pleasant and warm good afternoon to one and all. Today indeed is a very extraordinary day in the life of Al-Ikhlaas Academia Library and Resource Center. For what we are doing now is we are launching officially the library's studio, multimedia studio. What this allows us, it allows us to transcend our message, our production, our offerings, beyond national and regional borders. In turn, allowing us, to have a greater reach and, alhamdulillah, be of greater service and greater benefit to our community. The programs that we immediately wish to get off the ground would be the following five. One, the Ladies Terrace. Two, the Youth Breeze. These are two programs that are respectively focusing on challenges that our ladies and our youth are confronting on a daily basis, best articulated by a committee that is constituted with ladies and youth respectively. The third one would be our normal, being a library, in excess of 15,000 titles in our library. So we'll be having weekly book reviews as well. The fourth one would be similar webinars as these that we are currently about to launch. And the last one, a very general program called Converse Academia, a program that we could virtually slot anything in on a daily basis. It is now my absolute pleasure to extend a very profuse and the most heartfelt word of gratitude to our donors, and there's a multitude of them. They know who they are. It is indeed my fervent wish and du'as that Allah must continue to give them safety, good health, and an increasing rizq so that they may continue to do such sterling work in supporting, endeavors like these. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the inaugural webinar of the Al-Ikhlaas Academia Library Multimedia Studio. It is now my distinct pleasure and honor to hand you over to our anchor for the afternoon, none other than Mr. Shabodien Roomanay, for the inaugural webinar called The Ukrainian Crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilyas. That's very kind of you. Let's get into, I think it's such an important debate, and I have promised that we would keep it as short, sharp, and concise as we possibly can do. So let's get into the meat of what we're going to be doing, discussing rather today as quickly as possible. The topic is obviously the Ukraine crisis, and we've kind of formulated a little title that says the racist double standards, because that's what it's all about. It's not about analyzing the war itself. I think that's been done over and over in various media platforms. So we welcome viewers and listeners from Jakarta to New York. We know that there's some people in Kuwait listening to us and watching us, UAE, India, and also in Saudi Arabia, and of course our brothers and sisters in East and West Africa. This webinar is a part of a series, as Dr. Parker just indicated now, of discussions, debates organized by us as part of a campaign to educate and empower. Today's topic, as usual, is very relevant. The current war in Europe, a geopolitical play by nations on both sides of the divide, again raises the specter of the belligerent approach to resolving issues. And we know, how Europe has been embroiled in wars for years and years. The West, and I put that in quote, it has to be remembered, has been responsible for the loss of lives of millions of people over 2 world wars, and the intrusion of the USA into this theater of war to direct the fortunes of these people is clearly very, very apparent. However, today we discuss not so much the war and its impact and its direction, but more the incredible and shameless partisanship shown by these so-called developed nations with respect to its treatment of non-white spaces of conflict. And we talk here about the Rohingya, and the theft of a country called Palestine, the issue of the Tigrayans in Ethiopia, and the conflict obviously in South Sudan and also in Yemen as we speak. The outpouring of support, the opening of the doors for mainly white refugees, and the bigoted response to Syria, Iraqi and Afghani refugees by these very nations, a lesson to be learned by the rest of the world. Today's panelists, Mondli Makhanyad, editor of the City Press, which was established in 1982. Mondli was formerly the editor-in-chief of the Sunday Times here in South Africa, and he's an outspoken critic of deep-seated corruption in South Africa and other issues bedeviling our nations. And he recently penned an opinion piece reflecting on the perils of the 7-decade-old invasion of Palestine, and he juxtaposes this with the Ukraine conflict. Welcome, Mondli.
Greetings.
Then we have Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, who, believe it or not, is in Doha for some talks in Doha, who served first as the very active anti-apartheid campaigner. He was often jailed for his efforts, and as the Premier of the Western Cape, and as a member of the ANC before being posted to the United States of America as the South Africa's ambassador. His global view of the acute disparities between people and nations has led him to form the World for All Foundation that campaigns aggressively for addressing the developmental challenges faced by millions of people. Welcome, Ambassador Rasool.
Thank you very much, and Assalamu alaikum to your listeners, and good afternoon.
Wa alaikum salam. I love the tie, Ambassador.
Well, I'm looking a bit overdressed. I took off my jacket when I saw Mondli's very casual appearance in his garden there. I thought
it's a stunning setting, Mondli. So,
no, thank you.
So here's the program for today. Whilst this is not a debate, we're looking to find common cause that the treatment meted out to people of color vis-a-vis the current situation exposes the nationalistic fervor of the very European nations who, through their colonization of most of the world, are now seemingly cracking their spines to assist only their ill. Mondli, welcome and thank you for your time today, obviously. Perhaps opening comments from your side, Mondli?
Yeah, I think let's just start by establishing that Vladimir Putin is not a nice man. He's a terrible character. He has always been, and right from the time he began, from the time he took power in Russia, you know, we saw the kind of terror and carnage that he unleashed on the Chechens. We saw kind of like his abuse of human rights within his own country. So he has been a terrible person. It's not as if he just became bad now that he invaded Ukraine.
And annexation of Crimea.
And the interesting thing, yeah, I was saying, and the interesting thing is the West has always tolerated Vladimir Putin. He was their friend, and in fact, as far back as George Bush and Tony Blair, they used to praise him for being an ally in the fight against terrorism, they said. And so everything that he did wrong, they accepted. And it is only now that basically that the West is turning on him. So having established that, war is bad, war is illegal, the war in Ukraine is illegal, but then so is racism. So is double standards, so is hypocrisy. And we have seen basically, as you mentioned in the opening, about how refugees from all parts of the world have been turned away from Europe, whether it was Syria, Libya, kind of like the boat people from the rest of from the African continent and from the Asias and so on, either turned away or mistreated. And we see how the refugees from the Ukraine, who, as one of the TV people said, who are blonde and blue-eyed like us and own cars like us, have been welcomed and given luxury, or almost luxury accommodation, and arms have been opened for them. And then again, we see the hypocrisy and double standards again in the way that other conflicts have been treated. The longest occupation by a foreign power, as you again pointed out, and which I wrote about earlier, Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands and the treatment that is meted out, the brutal and cruel and inhumane treatment that is meted out to Palestinians and people of and Arab-speaking Israelis, which has been condemned many, many times in UN resolutions, and which all credible human rights organizations have termed an Israel, basically an apartheid-style state, and nothing from the West. Instead of actually condemning Israel, they protect Israel from any censure, and in fact, they arm and aid Israel financially and otherwise. So and that's basically that, and that's where we found ourselves. And then in this particular instance, because it is a blue-eyed and blonde populace mainly, they have been embraced, and the US, and the West has gone out of its way to bolster the Ukraine in this conflict with Russia.
Thank you, Mondli. Ambassador Ebrahim, your take?
No, thank you very much. And I think that we must value just the input that Mondli has made, because it's sometimes better said from someone who doesn't have a religious, emotional attachment to Israel to point out these kind of double standards. But I agree with him. I think we are seeing three sets of double standards and hypocrisies at work that has been exposed by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The one is a hemispheric hypocrisy or double standards. In 1962, when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries wanted to put missiles on Cuba, the world was brought to a standstill by the Kennedy regime, insisting that they will not have weapons and missile bases at their soft underbelly. And not only that, they also annexed part of Cuba, and that's the famous Guantanamo Bay that is there. When Russia today says exactly the same thing, don't expand NATO right to my soft underbelly and create that as a, then suddenly the world says, give the Ukrainians the freedom to choose. The Cubans never had the freedom to choose who could be. And so I think that the provocation is bad, but so is the invasion. And Putin's intention and Putin's character, I think, has waited for this moment. I think the second in the set of hypocrisies or double standards is the geopolitical hypocrisy. I think Mondli has said that already. It's about protecting spheres of influence, and so an occupation by Israel is tolerated, an invasion by the Soviet Union, the whole world is harnessed against it. The United States going into Iraq, going into Afghanistan, and having 30 years of war is good. Russia is bad. And so I think that the global racial order, I think I'm just here in the hotel where FIFA's headquarters is in Doha. And you can't help to think how quickly FIFA has mobilized its supporters, kicked out Russia, and basically politics is now okay on the soccer field if it's Ukrainian-based. But the same thing has not happened, for example, with other causes, such as the Palestinians. Individual players have had to stick their neck out. The third in the series of hypocrisies and double standards is the very issue of racism. I think Black Lives Matter have tried very hard to be able to make its stance known. I think, secondly, racism against the black and the brown people of the world have been subliminal. You know, no one calls you the K word in South Africa. No one really dares to call you the N word. And so it's all subliminal. You know there's racism, but you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't hear it. And suddenly it just becomes visible in the kind of blue-eyed, blonde-haired, white-skinned, they are us. Let's open our borders to them. Let's make it difficult for the brown and the black people to be refugees. Let's make it hard for an African-American to exist in the USA, and Muslims to be in France and be in Belgium and be all over Europe. And then you're faced with this plethora of Islamophobia, xenophobia, and racism, and so forth. And suddenly what the Ukrainian crisis has done is that it has brought the subliminal to become obvious, to become visible. Suddenly they now speak a language. They are like us. They share our religion, they share our skin color, they share our genetic makeup. And so they're okay. And we needed that. I think as Black people, we needed to have an affirmation that indeed racism is at work. And so if I'm thankful for what has happened in the Ukraine and Russian standoff, it is that racism is no longer subliminal. Racism has become obvious. Racism now has a language. Racism now has a set of speakers, and racism now has visibility.
Thank you, Ebrahim. And it seems that it's sufficient to have the English Football League having advertising that says no to racism, and that's the extent to which they would go to really make an impact. on the kind of deep-seated, as you say, subliminal racism. There are almost 1 million Rohingya refugees. There are 3 million Afghan refugees. There are 10 million Iraqi refugees. There are 4 million Sudanese refugees, and we know about 7 to 8 million Palestinian refugees. And these are all people who are not, the current Aryan race that people would just wipe off the table in the blink of an eye. But how do we address this? What in your opinion is now required to flip the switch, to get the world to understand what really is happening, one, and two, what needs to happen for us to change this kind of perception that's pervasive across the world? Mondli, what your take?
Look, I mean, like as Ebrahim points out, I think we can take positives from what has happened. And the fact is that the world mobilized so actively and so quickly for the Ukrainians. And, capitalism is capitalism. Capitalism wants money. But then when you have such giants as the McDonald's of this world, the Burger Kings and the Nikes and all of those people, basically kind of like rapacious capitalists who want money. For them, within a matter of weeks, weeks, to be able to mobilize so quickly to get out of, and basically to punish Russia for what they perceive to be an unjust act, means that it is possible for them to act against injustice. So I think let's take that from this and make it a marker to say that, okay, now that you have done this, now that you have done it this way, let's now extend it to all parts, to all areas of injustice around the world, to all incidents of injustice around the world. And so I think it's a moment that those who believe in justice and equal justice for all, that we actually, it's a moment of opportunity. It's a time to actually grab the moral high ground. And the noises that are made, the noises that we all who are in this forum right now can make, we should be making, and we should be developing strategies to say, okay, you have set this example. Now let's all proceed on it. And I think it's important that the world powers, particularly in the West, and humanitarian organizations, as well as global business, that those business giants, that they do not get let off the hook in the future, that they must keep getting reminded about this moment and what they did at this particular time in solidarity with Ukrainians and in punishing an aggressor.
Ibrahim, thanks very much, Mondli. Ibrahim, Mondli makes a very important point, and the kind of political imperative that continues to drive the world opinion. Given where you seated, given the fact that you are the founder of World for All organization, what is it that needs to happen, given the kind of scenario that's currently playing itself out in the European theater? What is it that needs to happen for the world to stand up and take note and say, we cannot continue in this way as a developed human race now, with access to information that's unheard of, given 5-10 years ago? What is it that can be done or should be done to change that narrative?
No, thanks very much. And just to link up with what Mondli had said, when the South proposes, for example, boycott, divestment, and sanction strategies to deal with Israeli aggression and occupation, those actions by its proponents are called anti-Semitic.
Yes.
And whereas now that very strategy against a similar invasion, similar occupation, similar aggression is now seen as the lifeblood of solidarity. I spent a lot of years in the US. Only in my time did the US Congress, for example, remove Nelson Mandela from the terrorist list, and did they now acknowledge that sanctions had a place in that struggle, but we know that Reagan did not want to do that. So suddenly they have now activated an instrument, and we must make it impossible for them never to remove that instrument as an alternative to war. I think secondly, I just listened this morning in the Doha Forum to Zelensky make an appeal to particularly the Muslim world and the Arab countries more specifically to put more oil on the market, to produce more gas on the market in order to break Russia's stranglehold over the production and the supply of oil and gas to the world. So very clearly there is, as Mondli says, a capitalist instinct at stake, demand and supply, because Zelensky knows that Russia may have the West by the balls. If the scarcity continues and if prices go up and inflation goes up and so forth, then the West may have to do a rapprochement with Russia in order to ease global inflation. But, you know, the World for All Foundation got into conversation with Wada Khanfar's Al-Sharq Forum 2 weeks ago in Istanbul, and it was televised and was put out onto the screen. And we said, this is not the moment for the global South, for Africa, Asia, Latin America, for the global Muslim community, and for the non-aligned countries of the world. This is not the time for us to choose sides between Russia and Ukraine. That's the narrative they want to suck us into. Our narrative has to be completely different. Our narrative has to be what Mondli says. What is the notion of global equal treatment of conflicts and people under pressure, people being oppressed, refugees? We don't want differentials between, on the one hand, white refugees, and on the other hand, black and brown refugees. We want equal treatment. If your country is in conflict, open the border to give relief to them. Secondly, we need to understand that maybe the standoff, it's effectively, Ukraine is a proxy for NATO standoff with Russia. It's effectively, we need to understand that the two remnants of superpowers in the world are financially stretched. Their populations don't have an appetite for war, and certainly the economy can't manage another war. This effectively sets up what Gramsci would call an interregnum, a moment in history that we don't choose sides between the tired superpowers, but that we ask, how does the global South, how does Africa, how does the Muslim world use the opportunity presented by this interregnum? In Arabic, it's called nafida, which means a window that opens but can close again. And that, for me, says this is the nature of that interregnum. The window has opened. Don't debate which side is right. Debate, how do we redesign a global governance system that is equal, that doesn't give one power the veto over what is right and wrong? How do we have an inclusive United Nations and a true multilateralism to make sure that we can eliminate injustice across the world and that we can bring lasting peace? How do we make sure that there is a standard that is going to be applied for human rights, freedom, and democracy to apply all over the world, and not just being a Western construct and not a bypass for the Muslim world that says it's okay for Muslims to be saddled with authoritarians and with occupations and conflicts because they are not civilized enough for rights and freedom and democracy. And so I think we've got to get into this interregnum, and we've got to be able to rethink the nature of the world as it is at this point.
Thank you, Ebrahim. I think the concept of the interregnum, I think it's an important window of opportunity, in fact. And Mondli, in your opinion, I mean, one of the key drivers to share information is the media platform in its various shapes and forms and so on. I mean, you're at the head of a very powerful newspaper that shapes opinions and thinkings in quite a substantial way. What, in your opinion, is the local and global media now need to do to make the change that Ebrahim is talking about? Or is there so much corporate control over a global media that the chances of that happening is 5% or 0%. Your opinion?
Yeah. If I can just, before, no, it's always so weird. I'm sure Ibrahim feels the same way. You know, when you are not on Shabodien, we see double of ourselves on the screen.
Oh,
and
oh dear.
feels very strange. Yeah. Just before I answer your question directly, there's another point I wanted just to touch on, and that was about just listening to Blinken and Biden over the past few, over the past few weeks, past month or so, when they speak about basically the atrocities that Putin has been committing, and they speak as if there was never an Iraq invasion. They speak as if there was never an Afghanistan invasion. They speak about basically kind of like that their role in the Balkans never happened. And I don't know, it's almost as if they've convinced themselves and that all of what their warmongering and the wars that they've waged were not real wars, that they did not result in any human catastrophe. That this is perhaps the first time in ages that another nation has actually brought kind of like this kind of misery to another nation. So I mean, so that's just every time I watch TV and I see them talking, it just always strikes me about this selective amnesia. Yeah, just to your question, I think so my tribe, the tribe being the media, being journalists, yeah, I think our role up to this point, particularly the global media, has been quite shameful. They have actually taken a side so openly in this conflict. And I mean, and you can take a side if you want to, but they've thrown away all pretense of any objectivity, of actually seeing another side. They've valorized the Ukrainian military, they've valorized Zelensky. He's suddenly now become the poster boy of democracy and great values. And you would, you'd swear that this guy, just before this conflict broke out, he was actually cracking down on human rights. He was actually cracking down on the media in his country. So this great Democrat that we now see and celebrate was not that guy. So, and the fear that I have is that kind of like in the normalization of what's going on there, basically the normalization of that arming of ordinary people, the normalization of basically allowing neo-Nazis and basically militias and bandits, basically kind of like who are now being treated as heroes in defense of their country by the media. And I think that has been, just a very terrible role that particularly the big global media has played in that conflict. And I think post this, there is going to have to be a need for the media to self-introspect about its role in these geopolitical conflicts, and also just the role when there are clearly two sides to an equation. I mean, two sides to a story. And as I said, yes, I mean, we can take sides and say Putin is bad, he should not have invaded and so on. But the whole interrogation of the build up, how it got to where it came to, I think that has been left out. Then what can be done? I think it is all of us to keep hammering on those, on that hypocrisy, on the racism that we have seen, on the double standards, and not letting it be easy for them to ever get away with it ever again. A CNN must be conscientized to know that that other conflicts are as important as a European conflict, that the suffering of people elsewhere are as important. And I think and very, very importantly, just on this, we've spoken a lot about Palestine, Israel, this afternoon. I think it is that moment to make a lot of noise about exactly what constitutes that particular crisis. I mean, and speaking as somebody who actually, I mean, like I've been there, and when you speak to people, kind of like, particularly people within the Jewish community of South Africa, I mean, like the first thing they'll say is, "But you don't know the truth. You have never been there." No. And those who actually have been there, people will come back. Actually, South Africans who have been there will come back. Actually, seeing how much, just how much worse it is than you previously thought. I was there about just over 10 years ago. And I remember coming back actually feeling that we experienced apartheid. Apartheid was terrible, it was evil and all of that. But actually seeing the evil of the Israeli regime and its apparatus, I mean, I actually felt, we actually, I could not have imagined anything worse than the National Party regime in South Africa. People who actually felt a regime that felt no shame about openly practicing apartheid. So I think there is a moment for conscientizing the global media, our own media, and the South African public about what is going on in the Middle East vis-a-vis, basically, and saying that what the outpouring of sympathy that we have seen for the Ukrainians must equally be experienced in relation to the Palestinian people.
Thanks, Mondli. Ebrahim, just on that point then, South Africa's supposed neutrality, both from a media statement point of view and its attempts at the United Nations to try and broker peace between the warring parties. Should South Africa, I mean, given our own history, and I mean, Tata Mandela's point, we'll only really be free when Palestine is free. Should this not then have been that moment when the South African government stands true to its cause and fight on what should have been a fight that says this far and no further, as a South African nation, as an African nation, never mind South African nation, here is our point. That as Africans, we believe that there's an injustice here of a big nature. The kind of double standards is incredible. Or are we, as South Africans, participating in that double standard?
I think that, South Africa must, in its foreign policy, learn to hold two opposing ideas at the same time, in the same way that I think Mondli is able to say Putin is bad and what Ukraine is doing is mad. And therefore, the answer isn't to choose one or the other, or even simply to go neutral. I think we've got to hold two opposing ideas, because that's the complexity of foreign policy in today's world. People always ask me, what's foreign policy? And I tell them that foreign policy is like a telescope. It has two lenses. One is your lens of your values, and the other is the lens of your interests. And depending on which lens you hold against your eye, you will be able to make mistakes or you make the best thing. If you view your interests through the lens of your values, then you begin to get to a sustainable foreign policy. If you change it around, like the West has done over the last decades, it views its values through the lens of its interests, then that's when you go wrong. So I think we've got to, in this current situation, we've got to look at our interests through our values. South Africa must never get into a position where its resolutions are said to be pro-Putin, because we had a president who once may or may not have been captured by Putin. We must be able to hold two opposing ideas at the same time. The second one that I would want to say is, I agree with Mondli. This is the moment to create a more sustainable, less emotional narrative and policy debate around the Palestinian situation. I think South Africa particularly needs to understand that our solidarity is important. But more important than our solidarity, because that's undisputed, is our strategic wisdom for the Palestinians at this moment. We've got to find a liberation movement in Palestine that isn't fragmented 10 ways, and that makes the solidarity choose which fraction of that movement or fragmented movement are you choosing. So I think we've got to force Palestinians to a common front and use our leverage of solidarity to say, Palestinians, create for yourself a united democratic front with a minimum set of conditions, because that's the precondition for you being free and for us supporting you. Secondly, let's de-Islamize the Palestinian solidarity and the Palestinian support. We play the Jewish game when we get into a religious discourse about Palestine, because they can go back 1,000 years before that and say how this was the promised land of the Jews, and then we come how this was where Shabodien was here, and so forth. So let's get out of the religious narrative, out of it, and call it what it is. It's a political robbery that has taken place. It's a political occupation, and it's a political repression.
It's a theft of a country.
It's the theft of a country. Secondly, let's do the surprising thing. Let's get out of the one state, two state debate. There are facts on the ground that have made the two state debate almost impossible. And therefore, what we must hold out is the idea of a single democratic state where Jews and Arabs, where Israelis and Palestinians must coexist. That there's nowhere anyone is going to go to. We've got to form a state where they, and that raising the stakes and getting out of the old narratives may be the leverage we have over Israel to choose whether it wants to continue to put facts on the ground or whether eventually it has to live with those facts in a single, undivided, democratic Palestinian state. So I think those are some of the ideas that I would say are very important. Our strategic advice also to the Palestinian liberation movements would be, don't fight on the terrain of strength of your opponents. You can never match the Israeli military machine with its nuclear weapons, with its dome that protects it. You can make a few symbolic gestures, but how do we turn the whole terrain around in much the same way that we gave Umkhonto we Sizwe the 60s to try and see how they can test the apartheid military? But by the 70s, 76 onwards, we understood that we can't match them on that. We've got to match them with popular power. And that was the moment of the 76 uprisings, the 1980s United Democratic Front, and so forth. So I'm saying we cannot simply, as South Africans, in this moment of interregnum, give the Palestinians more of the same. We've got to give strategic wisdom that comes from the battlefields. We can't just give them the name apartheid. Israel is an apartheid state. We've got to give them the strategies and tactics of what brought down our apartheid state, even though that one is increasingly more brutal, as Mondli says, than we have experienced.
Thank you, Ebrahim. Just latching on to what Ebrahim has just suggested, I mean, kind of finding a common ground with opposition in Palestine and other regions. I don't want to only focus on Palestine as the kind of fountainhead of oppression. There are the Rohingyas, there's Iraq has been bombed to pieces, there's the whole issue of Afghanistan still. What, in your opinion, should the global press be doing now, given the destruction of life and property in those regions? I mean, these countries are on their knees because of the activities, experimental activities almost of the Western powers. What role should the media be playing now, given the opportunity, given the window of opportunity that we were talking about early on, to change the narrative in as short a period of time as possible? What would you suggest?
Well, I think with the global media, I think quite a lot of it is driven by the national interest of their countries. If you will watch a CNN, it's very clear that that it's all about basically the priorities of Washington and what Washington is doing in relation, whether it's trade wars or whether it's human rights issues, whether it's any other form of contestation. I mean, like, and it's not as if they take instructions or they take cue from the powers that be. A lot of it has to do with basically kind of just like how the American mindset is oriented, and the journalists basically that also fit in within that. I've always been amazed about how in reporting, not in opinion, but in reporting, they speak about we, and that's a no-no in excuse me, in the world of media. Everybody is not, it is not supposed to be we, it is about the story that you are covering. If America is fighting with China, you are not a we. These are two powers contesting. So, but they insert themselves. So I don't hold out much hope for the American media. European media is slightly different. I think you do find kind of like in the UK, it's less homogeneous. So a Guardian will take a very progressive view on things, and I mean, obviously the Daily Mail and the others, particularly the Murdoch papers, will take a very different view. The BBC is not as jingoistic as CNN would be, for instance. So I think what can be done, I mean, like I think there can be an attempt to try and influence and sensitize the European media, and I think also, I mean, like if you look at the French media, also they are not as partisan as the Americans would be, for instance, but there obviously are pockets of partisanship there. So I think there is a potential there to influence those particular media in those countries to begin to look at the world differently, to treat the global South, as Ebrahim refers, as an equal partner in the development of humanity.
Thank you, Mondli.
Shabodien.
Yes.
Shabodien, if I could venture to give advice to a seasoned journalist like Mondli. You know, I was premier in the Western Cape in the 2004 period onwards, and the world was recoiling from the invasions of Iraq and so forth, when journalism, in a sense, got it wrong. And I hosted the International Union of Journalists for a dinner at my residence, and we had them go to meet with Nelson Mandela on Robben Island because we wanted to show them certain things. So I think we need at this moment, before we replay the same movie, because we've seen this movie, when Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden was fighting the Soviet Union, they were armed to the teeth and resourced. And then those same arms and resources were used when Bin Laden turned on the West. So he was the hero in the first round, he was the villain in the second round. Saddam Hussein, when he was doing the proxy war against Iran of 1980, he was the hero armed to the teeth with chemical weapons. When they tired of him because he threatened another ally, Kuwait, He became the villain. And so Colin Powell had to manufacture a narrative in the United Nations about why they need to bomb him to smithereens. I think in much the same way with Afghanistan, they needed to strike, even though all the intelligence said that the operatives of 911 came from Arab-speaking countries, not Afghanistan. And so we saw that same movie playing itself out. How many more can journalism make the same mistake? Is this not a time, for example, Mondli, when a critical group of journalistic practitioners from the South must say, we want an urgent convening of bodies like the International Union of Journalism. We need to say, before we continue down this path, let us think and reflect on the mistakes of the past, because we're heading headlong into the same path that brought our credibility down, that seeded the ground to populist social media setting the agenda. And we are making those same kind of mistakes. I don't know if we can play that kind of role.
Mondli, it's an interesting
very interesting. I think and I would say challenge accepted. I think you have definitely planted an idea there, and I'll say it's something that I would certainly be very involved in triggering and going forward. Ebrahim just reminded me when he was talking about the fact that he invited journalists into the home. Just saying, journalists are, one of the things that journalists are famous for is the consumption of certain haram liquids. and in that, I remember being in that house, that cellar had been cleared of all of those haram liquids during Ebrahim's tenure as premier. So it must have been difficult for those thirsty journalists.
I was going to ask Mondli, I wonder where the haram liquids are now. Somebody took possession of it. And Ebrahim, I don't know why you're laughing, Ebrahim. You look guilty.
No. They've certainly not been consumed by me. Everyone knew that we closed that. No, we wanted a sober discussion amongst journalists. And I think, Mondli, I'm very happy that you're accepting it. I think you have a bully pulpit as a South African media that have fought apartheid, that have fought through the transition, that have fought in the first generation, and most importantly, where you have fought our own government when it became corrupt. That is an enormous credibility and trust factor that you shouldn't lose. And I think we must use that as the convening power for this moment of reflection and recoil that I think journalism requires, because the way they are the drum majorettes of the war, it's obscene.
Just on the question of acting as an honest broker, and given we were talking about the South as a kind of region of sensibilities, and a region where there's a possibility that we could act as an honest broker. Can South Africa, in this particular instance, act as an honest broker? What do you think, Mondli?
I think we could, but I fear that we did a lot to erode our credibility, particularly over those, what is now known as the wasted decade. We were a country, we were a people that were looked up to by the international community, by various countries, not just because we had a Nelson Mandela, but because we had achieved something quite spectacular. And people wanted, and our story was being used as an example of it can be done, it can be achieved. And we had the people within our ranks, whether it was political, in the faith communities, in business, people whose voices were listened to outside. And then we did turn ourselves into a bit of a joke during those years. But I think even post the Zuma years, I don't think we've quite asserted ourselves as that country that was there before. So I think we need to regain that moral authority. I keep hearing kind of the president and others in parliament and in government speaking about the possibility of South Africa playing that honest broker role in this particular conflict. I don't think we are quite there yet. I think we can get there. We can rebuild that. There was a just present company, while present company is here. I think there was a time, I think during your time in the US, Ebrahim, when your voice, and it was quite a polarizing time in that country, and your voice was one that was listened to across the board, because you came from here, but also your view, your view of the world and your view of basically multi-ethnicism and multi-religious interfaith conversations was something that actually gave you and your country a certain level of gravitas and an ability to get into conversations that others would not be able to.
Well, I think Mondli is right, because, and one of the reasons that I could speak with some authority was that I was not seen as the representative of Jacob Zuma, but as the victim of Jacob Zuma. He removed me as premier. And so people didn't have a trust deficit in me, and I used the centenary of the ANC and the memorial to Nelson Mandela to reassert those values. But to just make one sentence out of it, I think, Mondli, our country, our national standing has been dented. But I think within that overall dent, there are pockets of excellence like the media. I'm not speaking about what has happened to one media company and so forth. I'm now speaking about people like you. But I do think that people like you have an enormous credibility, a convening power for journalism. Let's at least work on the issues of narrative generation that I think you have a convening power and moral authority over.
Thank you, Ebrahim. I think powerful kind of suggestion. Mondli, closing remarks.
Yeah, just to go back to the beginning, and just basically that we should highlight the hypocrisies and double standards over and over again. I think that we cannot say them, we cannot do too much to point them out. Then again, I think just to go from what Ebrahim has just said, I think that recognize that we are not powerless, and that all of us and everybody who is in this conversation, whether they spoke or not, I mean, that let us be those people who actually do make that noise. Let us, in all our different spaces, let's utilize our individual and collective power to make this moment count.
Thank you, Mondli. Ebrahim, we know that telling a lie often enough gets people to believe it. Surely it's the same thing applies to the truth. Your closing remarks?
No, I think, you know, if my thesis is correct, that the Russia-Ukraine standoff constitutes an interregnum, a nafida, a window that has opened for a short time, then we must go into an occupied at multiple levels. And I've made one suggestion to Mondli about how in the media, narrative producing space, we can do that because they're going down the same path. But I think for those who love and support Palestine, let us qualitatively shift the debate, not quantitatively. You see, we think if we say the same thing over and over, if we say the same kind of paradigm over and over, that we are filling and shifting the debate. We are shifting the quantity of the debate, but not the quality of the debate. It has to become strategic, not just solidarity. It has to be hard talks. We must have the right to have hard talks with our Palestinian brothers and sisters and say, hey, you're messing up here. Learn from us. We've made that mistake already. Our support for them is not only a blank check. It has to be hard-nosed. And the same thing, bring the Yemen conflict to the fore, because I can tell you that as Ukraine sucks the oxygen out of the room, Yemen is suffering because under the radar, things are happening there. And so how do we bring those things to the attention of the world? I think this is the time for everyone who's had an activist bone in his body or her body. This is the time for us to populate it with facts, populate it with truths, populate it with boldness and courage, and fill the gap qualitatively with, don't be anti-intellectual in your support of any group. Be intellectual, political, and strategic as we go forward.
Thank you very, very much to both Ebrahim Rasool, Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And particularly for all your comments and suggestions that you've made. And so too also to Mondli Makhanyad. It's been a brilliant session, I think. And we will have more of these debates and discussions. They're important. And I think Mondli in particular has a lot of work to do, I think, given the weight of what needs to be done. And I know, and we know that he's perfectly capable of doing that, and we will assist him wherever we can. Thank you very much to both Mondli and to Ebrahim for your time. Ebrahim is in Doha in Qatar, and Mondli is in Johannesburg in South Africa. Thanks also to Fahad, Samir and Mahir, our technicians in the background, who's done a stunning job at this inaugural webinar that we've organized in the Academia Library Studios here in Cape Town in South Africa. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was kind of you. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon.
Thank you.
And good afternoon, Mondli.
Thank you.